When we look to the Olympics, it's a little bit sobering, really. I think particularly when you look at the medal tally of some countries compared to us. Just about everybody's got more medals than us. Although when I was looking at the tally yesterday, Uzbekistan had more gold medals than Great Britain. And of course, the Aussies have got more medals than us. But hey, should a little country at the bottom of the South Pacific be comparing itself to bigger nations with more resources? Do we tend to lose out when it comes to the comparison game? We're looking today at the topic of education and perhaps some old school lessons that we could learn for how people are doing education in other parts of the world, given that the current education system in New Zealand seems to be failing the current cohort of students. Joining me on the program now from the Maxim Institute, Maryanne Spurdle. Kia ora, good morning.
Good morning, Andrew.
Are you watching the Olympics at your place?
Oh, I've only caught about 15 minutes of it, so I have not seen a lot yet.
And hey, Team New Zealand all the way. Are you would be cheering for your adopted country, or does it get? I mean,
this is my birth country. The accent ended up confused out for it. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
no, New Zealand all the way. Saw some of the rowing.
Just wanting to clarify that for people
Just-
that
yeah.
may be confused. Yeah, exactly. Because it is tempting sometimes to go, oh yeah, but you know we can be associated with this country as well because they seem to be doing better than us, right? When it comes to education, though, I mean, this is something we've talked about beforehand. It's not only the Olympics that we're doing worse than most of the world. When compared to other OECD countries, our outcomes don't really measure up, do they?
Yeah, and we've kind of got used to, OECD does a survey, we're middle of the pack, and we go, well, yeah, that figures we've got fewer resources. But this survey on drivers of trust in public institutions, they asked people, are you satisfied with your national education system?
Mm-hmm.
And on average, 30 countries, 57% on average said they were satisfied. 55% of Kiwis are satisfied with the way things are. So that's not fabulous.
No.
Australia, it's 71% are satisfied.
Wow.
They came tied for fourth, so they weren't a medal winner. You've got Finland with gold; they've got 81% satisfied. Switzerland, 76% satisfied. Denmark, 74%, and then Australia and the Netherlands. And I think we would assume that going to school in Australia would look a lot like going to school here.
You'd think
but
so.
There are some things that, yeah,
and
their education system is actually very different.
And honestly, when we compare ourselves to the Scandinavian countries, I mean, that's just not fair. You know, these are the geniuses that bought us flatback furniture. They're always going to be top of the table at a lot of things. But if the Aussies are doing so much better than us, that sticks in the throat. That's got to hurt. And like you say, you'd think that it would be similar culturally, because I mean there is a problem I think sometimes when we go, oh gosh, this is working in a different part of the world, we should do exactly what they do, but it doesn't match culturally. But surely if what the Aussies are doing, if they're satisfied with that, it's not going to be culturally too dissimilar to what's happening over here, right?
Yeah, and as you know, I've been looking into more equitable access to education over the last few months. So I've been doing a lot of looking into what different countries are doing as far as especially funding education.
Yeah.
In Australia, one of the key differences there is both the state and the central government heavily subsidize both Catholic schools and private schools. So if you decide to have a private school education, you don't pay full tuition, which opens it up to way more people. 36% of kids go to non-public schools in Australia. So there's way more choice. It's not as equitable so in the Netherlands, which is tied for fourth place with them, the government funds private schools at the same level as public schools.
Wow.
So if you are a school, you get funding. So they're relatively autonomous schools, and people seem to like that. And then with Finland, Switzerland, and Denmark, all of them have very localized control of schools. It's not centrally managed. That the decision making is devolved, and unsurprisingly, people like that.
Yeah.
They like it better when educators and parents have more influence than politicians and unions and bureaucrats.
Although
so that played out in the rankings.
Exactly. Although this does have, of course, political implications. Surely, if
Yeah.
the people are happier with the educational system within their country, they're going to be more likely to vote for the political party that bought them that educational system that they're happier with. Although that may move slower than perhaps the average political electoral term.
Yeah, I think here we've got this assumption that the government funds public schools. It does actually here put a little bit of funding into private education and a very nominal amount to people who are homeschooling.
Yeah.
But the countries that don't, I've mentioned Mexico before. Greece was the least popular education system. 37% of Greeks are happy. There are 47% are unhappy. They've got a model where the government doesn't fund any independently managed schools.
Yeah.
So we're there. We do a little bit, but not much. And I think there's this assumption that that's just the way it always will be and always should be. And so with the proposed, it's really an introduction to charter schools. Last time it wasn't a general model that would be available to many people. There's this attitude that it wouldn't be fair to use public funds for a private organization that wants to run a school, even though that's the way our GP clinics operate. And other things, we do that all the time where public funds go to a private provider. But for some reason, education is too holy for that. So looking overseas, no, actually more and more throughout the OECD, especially, countries are funding schools. And the reason for that is, if you fund an independently operated school, that means that those who have low incomes and live in poorer areas, they now have the choices that people who can live in wealthier suburbs and who have good incomes, they now have those choices. And that reduces the gap socioeconomically. It reduces the gaps in outcomes, which in New Zealand, we've got very wide gaps. That's why they're doing it.
And hey, again, this is a longer term solution. This is a longer strategy in that regard. I suppose part of the challenge at the moment, you talk about government funding, and the government is very big on the fact that the times are tough, that cuts are needing to be made, that they don't have the resources to fund the health system adequately, so they're working the best they can with what they've got. The same is true of our defence budget. Having said that, I suppose education for children, I mean, all of these children need educating. We're not necessarily changing the numbers of children who need to have their education funded.
No.
We're just saying which buckets we're putting that same amount of money in.
Yeah, exactly. The argument is that, you're taking it away from public schools. But if the kids are leaving the public schools as well, which I'd like to point out, about 20% of schools are oversubscribed. They don't have enough spaces for the kids who are enrolled. If they had 5 or 10% of their kids go to a little local school that started up, that would be good for that public school because then they wouldn't be in dire need of more classrooms. The other problem they have is recruiting teachers. If you're running a public school, you have to pay a teacher exactly what the collective pay agreement requires. If they're an excellent teacher, you can't pay them more. If they're a poorer teacher, you can't pay them less. And there's a cap. You can only pay them so much. Independently operated schools are allowed to say, you've got engineering expertise, and we'd like to recruit you from whatever industry they're in. We can pay you more. They can shuffle their funds around. They're allowed to. So independently operated schools, they've got more tools to recruit people from outside of the school system and to retain them. And that is a huge problem. Every year, the PPTA puts out a secondary schooling staffing survey, and now 27% of vacant teaching positions in secondary schools are going unfilled. There's no one for them. And 73% of classroom jobs and 44% of leadership jobs, there was either no potential choice of suitable applicants or just one. So they're having to employ people on limited authority to teach, which is supposed to be like an emergency thing that only happens sometimes. And that,
certainly not a criticism of teachers in our state schools, but it is no surprise economically that the better teachers are going to either the private schools or Australia, honestly.
Well, and some of them are leaving teaching altogether. The other thing that this survey tracks is how many are leaving year on year and how many are leaving the profession.
Yeah.
And that is going up. That's been going up steadily. And so if they don't come back, it's just going to get harder. And the ones who remain are going to have more pressure, and that pressure is going to make it more likely that they will leave. So opening up schools that have more options for employment, it's actually going to make things better for public schools as well, because there will be more educators in the pool, and there will be more classrooms popping up independent of the public school system. So it's good for everyone, really.
Yeah. So charter schools or government funding of private schools in partnership with private organisations, perhaps, that's not just good for the private schools, that's good for the public schools as well.
Yeah, it is.
Another one of the issues on this one, because in part it's about the funding, but it's also about the control, I suppose. And you mentioned this at the beginning when we're doing the comparison, is whether or not receiving money from the government as a private school also means that you cede sovereignty in that regard, that you need to now, we need to lockstep with the Wellington dictated curriculum, and we're giving up some of our independence as a private school in order to receive that funding. It can't be one without the other, surely.
Well, private schools at the moment can't become charter schools. And so if they're fully private, then they get like a stipend per student, and they can teach their own curriculum. As long as they're meeting the standards that requires, you're good. Charter schools will be able to do that and get the funding. So they'll be able to teach their own curriculum, and teachers, they'll be able to employ up to a certain percentage that don't have the required in the public system teacher qualification. Not their whole staff, but a certain percentage won't have to have that qualification. And they're free to write their own curriculum, just as private schools are, as long as they meet the outcomes that are required.
Which is, the best of both worlds in that regard. Here's some money, and you don't have to necessarily do exactly what we think you should do. Now, in terms of the way the government is tracking towards this, what would you give them what sort of school grade would you give them on this one, Maryanne?
I've looked at the legislation. They're hoping to get it passed in the next couple months. And I think in September. It looks, especially looking overseas and what's being done overseas, it looks like it's picked the good things of what's happening overseas. In the US, they can't have for-profit charter schools. However, those schools can contract to for-profit organizations. And the research into that shows that the quality, it isn't determined by profit or no profit. What it's determined by is control over key decisions. So things like staffing, if they contract out staffing decisions, then they tend to have worse outcomes. Whether or not the for-profit doesn't really matter. So they can be for-profit here. I don't think that's going to be an issue. You don't go into education to make money when you're getting per student funding at the same level of public schools. That's just not going to happen.
Exactly.
It just gives them freedom over where they channel the money. So the legislation looks good. What I'd really like to see is the schools that are working in low socioeconomic areas. If they're a new startup, they have to fund their own building and everything. Only schools that switch from public schools get to keep their buildings. So they are allowed to charge a fee, a nominal one, just for property maintenance. And I think that is going to be a hurdle in low socioeconomic areas. They're the ones that need it the most. It would be really great if there was some alteration to the legislation that allowed schools in those areas to give up the right to charge fees and get more money per student, which would be controversial because, same. But I think that'd be helpful.
Certainly, and hey, to be fair, we haven't seen the results yet, so we can't officially grade the policy until that is enacted, as it were. But hey, thank you for the work that you do at the Maxim Institute. The article entitled "Even Public Schools Need Charter Schools" going to be posted on the Maxim website, maxim.org.nz, a little bit later this week. Maryanne, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrew. See you.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.